As we talked about earlier in the program, the United States has ended its 20-year war in Afghanistan. President Biden claimed success with the mission of airlifting more than 100,000 people out of the country, even as it cost the lives of 13 U.S. service members and hundreds of civilians in recent days. The president again acknowledged the White House was caught off guard by the swift surrender of Afghan forces to the Taliban.
That assumption that the Afghan government would be able to hold on for a period of time beyond military drawdown turned out not to be accurate.
And joining us now is Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and former U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013. Ivo Daalder, thank you for coming back here on Chicago Tonight. Good to see you.
My pleasure. Good to be back.
So in the diplomatic community, is this withdrawal and the ending of this war and the execution of it seen as a success, as the president sees it?
Well, I think you have to make a distinction between the different levels. First of all, on the decision on whether or not to withdraw. I think largely people around the world are seeing that decision as the right decision, a decision that was in fact long in coming and probably should have been taken a lot earlier. It is probably a decision that would have benefited from more consultation with our allies at NATO, who, by the way, have been with us in this mission from day one until the very last day. But overall, the idea that the United States and its allies should end this mission is something that finds widespread support among allies and indeed among the American public. Then the question on execution. And here one hears grumbling from particular allies, particularly in Europe, that there was not enough consultation, not enough information being shared about how the withdrawal was going to happen. I think looking back at some of the decisions that were made, one can say there is a reason to be critical, and one could have done perhaps a better job. But overall, I think we also have to remember that any evacuation, particularly when it takes place in a hostile environment, is going to be extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily complex as an operation. And within that background, no one has ever taken 122,000 people out of a country in which it no longer controls the ground, or much else.
Certainly that happened in a swift amount of time, but the president keeps saying that consensus was Afghan security forces would hold longer. Were there any voices, either in the United States or among U.S. allies, that said the opposite, that said that the U.S. should prepare for a scenario where the Taliban takes over in the blink of an eye?
I mean, there were no doubt some voices here and there. There's been internal reviews of the Afghan security forces by members of the Inspector General's group in the Department of Defense that have warned that perhaps these forces weren't as strong as people had hoped. Clearly, the Biden administration itself and the president himself had long believed that the government of Afghanistan was corrupt, that it would be unable to stand on its own 2 feet for all that long. That was the consensus of the intelligence community. I think the assumption that somehow it would stay in control for long enough for people to leave on their own was probably a wrong assumption, would probably have to be relooked at as one takes an after-action review. But no one, as far as I can tell, including the intelligence community, was saying that the Taliban would be able to take over what really in the end was a matter of days or weeks, all of the district capitals, let alone Kabul, as it did on the 15th of August.
And there's also an assumption among more hawkish voices that there was a third path here, a middle ground, where the U.S. could maintain a small troop presence in that country, and it would have remained more stable than it is today, I guess, in perpetuity. Is that a realistic assumption?
Yeah, I'm with the president on this one. I actually don't think that option was a real option. The idea that somehow the status quo as it existed on January 2021, when Joe Biden became president, could somehow be prolonged in perpetuity with the current forces on the ground. Remember, just 2,500 U.S. forces to 8,000 total troops, with a significant number of contractors as well. Those forces were there under the assumption, and the situation that existed in the country was based on the assumption that the United States and all foreign forces, including contractors, were going to be withdrawn by May 1st, 2021. That was the agreement that former President Trump negotiated with the Taliban back in February 2020 in return for the Taliban not attacking U.S. forces and not doing large-scale carnage against Afghan civilians. We would withdraw. So the question that the president had before him when he became president was either to fulfill that commitment in one form or another, or to say, no, we need to go back and stay in Afghanistan. But staying in Afghanistan would have meant taking on the Taliban that by that time had been in the strongest military position, including controlling major parts of the country since the war in 2001. 5,000 Taliban prisoners had been released at the behest of the Trump administration as part of this deal. Others had flown across the borders in the anticipation of the withdrawal of the United States and other forces. And so we would have had to take those on. Whether that was many tens of thousands more troops or not, I don't know. I haven't seen the analysis. But the idea that you could have kept security in this country when the Taliban was on the verge of victory with just 2,500 troops just doesn't strike me as a realistic option.
And the president says that the alternative was indeed, he believes, going to be an escalation. What is next for Afghanistan under Taliban rule?
Well, first of all, the Taliban is not, in fact, ruling in terms of governing the country. It is in control, sole control of all the major capitals, much of the rural area. But it now has to do two things. One, it has to actually take care of a country of 39 million people, half of whom are living in subsistence, and because of drought and the economic crisis are facing a humanitarian crisis. They have to find ways to deliver for their people. They have to maintain security. They have to maintain an economic system that, in contrast to the economic system they had back when they were still in control in the late 1990s, is now integrated with the international economy. Do they have the people who know the financial markets, who know how to do trade, who know how to run a complex system? So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two, of course, is that they may have won this particular battle in a long-standing fight within Afghanistan, but whether they can actually win the war in the long term is to be seen. Already, we are seeing opposition forces marshaling in various parts of the country, and we may well see, unfortunately for the people of Afghanistan, more fighting, more conflict to decide who, in fact, gets to control what part of Afghanistan for how long.
Ivo, we only have a couple seconds here, but the existential question, is there a bit of soul searching the United States is doing now in terms of this notion over the last 20 years of exporting democracy to a part of the world that has not had any experience with democracy and exporting it via the sword?
I surely hope so, and I think the strongest part of the president's remarks were in fact directed at this. This idea that somehow we can go into countries with large militaries and somehow transform these societies from the inside out in a completely different way. We've tried it. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked in Afghanistan. We spent incredible treasure in lives, in casualties, in money. And in the end, we end up where we started, with the Taliban in control of the very country that we invaded almost exactly 20 years ago.
All right, a lot to think about. Ivo Daalder, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.